Okay, cool. Okay, so after receiving this presentation, you guys can have the recording, you guys can watch the recording. And if you have any further questions after viewing the recording, you can always reach out to me. My information is in this deck. You can also ask Caesar for my information, but I'd be more than happy to dive into any questions with you guys, complimentary, you know, run through anything, be a second set of eyes, all those sorts of things. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get going on today's presentation. So first and foremost, I kind of always feel obliged to just sort of quickly mention, sometimes in some cases, the legislation, it can be a little bit politicized, or, you know, people will field, they'll ask me to field questions, you know, why is this the worst thing that's ever happened to America? Or how could this have, whatever. It's like, look, you know, we're just here to talk about the bill, the legislation, and the things that are in it. So my quick rule for today, I said, here's some perfectly nice people. Here's some other perfectly nice people. And look at us, just dancing in harmony, talking about legislation and how it impacts employers, and just kind of talking about some of the nuts and bolts of the bill. So with that in mind, remind me, Toby, what's in it? What do employers need to know? So first and foremost, we have the shared responsibility provision. And today's presentation is specific for folks that have PACOM as their HRIS system, but obviously the legislation applies to everybody. So we're kind of talking about teaching everyone and giving everyone sort of their sea legs, so to speak, on the legislation and the parameters within the bill, so that as we navigate our setups in PACOM or any HRIS system, as we look to the employers kind of setting their world up, we understand what the bill is asking, so that we know what the system is asking us to do. It makes a little bit more sense. So first and foremost, it's so full of qualifiers, right? It's like, eligible employers must offer affordable coverage to eligible employees, right? It's like, all right, what's an eligible employer? You know, what do you mean by affordable coverage? Which employees need to have it, right? And so that's kind of the broad strokes of the employer's responsibility. And first and foremost, you have to see, are you even an eligible employer? And that line is drawn at 50 employees, but they also count FTEs. And so when we're in our PACOM system, there's several handy reports. And one of the reports just shows you the full-time status. It shows you on a month-by-month basis, do we have more or less than 50 employees, including our FTEs? Because if we do, and we'll dive into it in a second, but we need to make sure we're offering health insurance to at least 95% of the full-timers, right? So the FTEs, the full-time equivalents, we'll get into how you do that math, but those guys only count with respect to, are we large enough or not? And if that's a yes or no question. And once we get to the yes on that, then we go, all right, so scrap all that. We've hit yes. Now all I need to do is look at my legitimately full-timers, and I need to make sure that I've offered health insurance to at least 95% of them. Or if I'm not, and one of them gets a subsidy, I'm out of compliance. And compliance can be costly. The mandates are indexed every year. The so-called A penalty is going up from $240 a month to $247.50, right? So that's almost $3,000 a year. And you would be fined on every one of your full-time employees, minus the first 30. I'm not really 1,000% sure why they do the 30-man discount, but they do. So quick math on that. If you had a 130 employee company, minus the first 30, so you're only fined on 100 of those, but you'd be fined at that, you know, $2,970 a year. So it'd be almost $300,000 fine. So if this employer, even at just 130 lives, is not offering coverage to the right swath of people, this can be a very costly mistake for them. And so that's why it's really important that we appropriately understand. And again, another one of the handy reports in the PACOM system tells us, are we at that 95% threshold or not? Because the system knows who our full-timers are and who's been offered benefits. So that is our easiest way to tell, are we plus or minus that 95% threshold? Do we need to extend coverage to some extra people in order to hit it? Or are we risking hefty penalties? Okay, if you're not sure even whether or not the law applies, right? So there's some groups we work with, you know, they've got thousands of employees. no problem. They are darn sure that they're north of 50. We've got other groups that just have just a small handful of folk, and they're darn sure they're under 50. But you might work with an organization, you might be curious, you might need to know the math. And so the way that the math works out is, again, you add all of your legitimate full-timers, but you got to figure out your FTEs, your full-time equivalent. So what you do to do that is you take the total hours of service that was worked by those part-timers and divide that by 120, and you get a full-time equivalent. So I'll show an example of the math on this next slide where we go, all right, let's just say I've got 30 part-time employees. I got 30 people that work for my organization, and those guys are coming in doing, dribs and drabs of work. But all told, all 30 of those people combined for 1,800 hours of labor in the month before. Okay, that 1,800 hours of labor divided by 120, that's the fixed denominator given to us by the legislation. That turns out to be 15 FTEs. If I also had 36 full-timers, like I got 36 people that show up Monday to Friday, 8 to 5, I might have thought to myself, I'm not a 50 life group, I'm a 36 life group. I don't need to care about the ACA rules. But when I look at how many FTEs I have because of my part-time workers, as far as legislation is concerned, I'm a 51 life group. And therefore, I am an ALE, or applicable large employer. So you do this calculation every month over month, and you try to see, all right, on average in the year before, did I employ 50 employees or more or less? Am I a full ALE? And if so, then in the next calendar year, I need to offer benefits. So that's how you figure out whether or not you even have to do all this stuff, okay? Now, again, you're only responsible for extending coverage to the legitimately full-timers, okay? The FTEs are only used to figure out if you're an ALE, or applicable large employer. All right, so I get it, Toby. I'm large enough to qualify. I have to offer benefits. I get that part. The eligible employer section of that first qualified sentence, got it. What types of benefits would qualify, right? What's good enough? So first and foremost, there's a couple of aspects of affordability. I'm not going to dive too far into it, but one of them is the actuarial value of the plan. And what they're basically saying is you have to carry at least a 60% actuarial value. In other words, you can't get away with those cheapy plans that have way too high of deductibles or copays or mini med plans, those sorts of things. In order to satisfy a part of the legislation, the underlying health insurance has to be of a certain robustness, right? And if you're buying really anything on the fully insured market space, it's quite difficult to get something that's not, of the requisite value. But that's one thing. But so, okay, assuming your plan pays at least 60% of the health insurance, it hits that actuarial value. What you're getting into now is the premium split when they talk affordability, right? So affordability is not just the robustness of coverage, but it's also what you charge the employee on the monthly basis. And that's where the law says that the employee's premium cannot exceed 9.5%. And I've already put that into quotations, and I've already, parenthetically cited. That's what the law said, but they do index this number annually. So you're going to watch it bounce around. The 2024 figure is actually down quite a bit. It's down to 8.39%. That's down from 9.12 in this year. But you have this requisite percentage, which again in 2024 will be 8.39%. And the cost of the employee's premium cannot exceed that number of their gross annual salary for the employee-only portion of the lowest cost plan design. This, again, gets into a lot of qualifiers, right? Employers were pretty immediately like, how am I supposed to know my employee's gross annual salary, right? How do I get to this figure? How do I make sure I'm not fined, right? And I'll dive into all that in a second before quickly noting that buy-ups and dependents are not the employer's responsibility. You do not need to be affordable per what plan the employee took. You just need to make sure that there's an affordable option. Okay. So as we mentioned a moment ago, figuring out employees' annual earnings can be tricky. Employers pretty immediately were like, I don't necessarily know my employees' annual earnings per se. They might have other things, profits and losses in their world that I don't necessarily know about. Plus, I need a good number. So we get into some safe harbors for this, right? The three main safe harbors are, number one, the employee's W-2 wages, as reported in box 1, generally as the first day of the plan year. So when you're talking about something to be affordable relative to, some clients will do the W-2. I personally find this to be the least common of the safe harbors, but some folks will do it. The next one is probably the second most common one, which is the rate of pay. So just take the employee's hourly wage, excuse me, multiply that by 130, and that gets you a monthly figure, right? So, hey, Mr. and Miss Employee, you earn, I don't know, $20 a month. So, excuse me, you earn $20 an hour. I'm going to multiply that hourly wage by the requisite figure given to me by the legislation, which is 130, and we're going to end up at $2,600 as your quote unquote monthly rate. And then I will set affordability off of that with whatever the bounce around percentage is, which again, in this case is 8.39% of that figure. The most common one, however, is number 3, the federal poverty level. And that's because you don't need to do a bunch of math. Obviously, your organization, not everyone's going to have the same W-2. Not everyone's going to have the same hourly rate of pay. So those two things being so malleable can sometimes make this a little bit harder. If you've got an option to do the federal poverty limit safe harbor, it's the cleanest, the easiest. And you're basically just saying, use the requisite percentage and stick it next to the federal poverty limit. And because it's the most common, I did do the math on that, right? So 2023 federal poverty limit line, the safe harbor in 2024, you would have multiplied that federal poverty limit, which in this case, which again is also indexed annually. The mainland one is 14,580 multiplied by the 8.39% figure, and that gets you 1,223.26 as the sort of monthly rate, and that is excuse me, the annual rate. And when you take that monthly, it's $101.93 per month. In other words, again, buy-ups, dependents, not your concern. If you have any plan in the portfolio, any plan where the employee only monthly premium deduction is 101.93 or less, you can use the federal poverty limit safe harbor. And the reason this is important to dive into is because, again, there are a few different safe harbors to use. Your employer group, your group will have to set affordability, and it will have to kind of declare a major, so to speak. You got to use one of these for everybody. You can't mix and match. And so as you're going through ACA setup in the system, you need to denote to it which safe harbor are we using, and you want to make sure that you're standing on steady footing when you choose one of those. And that's why I tell groups, if you've got anything in your portfolio that qualifies for number 3 here, let's just use that, right? So a lot of groups say, well, my base plan is whatever, $50 a month or $75 a month or even $100 a month for the employee only portion. But, again, my PPO is my bias, my dependents. You go, great. Just use the federal poverty limit safe harbor because it applies to you and it makes everything downstream a little bit easier. Okay. In figuring, so that's the types of plans that we are eligible to offer. Now we're talking about to whom do we offer. The legislation gives you a couple of safe harbors, and the main one that folks will take advantage of is the look back period, right? And so we'll dive into it right now. You have your look back period where you say, okay, from day X to day Y, I am going to measure. And then following that, you'll have what's called a stability period, where you apply the results of that measurement period and either offer or don't offer. It's sort of like a game of freeze tag, where you say, okay, we're going to measure from a certain date range, and then we're going to hold the results of that measurement for a subsequent date range, regardless of what occurs in that stability period. We're playing a game of freeze tag here. Okay. So the employer gets to define their standard measurement period. And I'm going to dive into initial measurement period in a moment, which is for new hires only. The IRS uses the term standard measurement period to distinguish it from that. The standard measurement period is the ongoing, every year, year in and year out time frame where you say, okay, I don't necessarily as an employer want to apply these ACA laws every month where I'm constantly adding and terming employees based on how many hours they worked in a given month. I want to have some more consistency. I want to utilize the safe harbors of the look back stability. So my measurement period has to be consecutive calendar months, at least 3, no more than 12. And to be honest with you, I always recommend 12 because more data is good. Okay. So when you're setting the standard measurement period, you've got a few different choices, but obviously for some organizations, sometimes are busier than others, sometimes are slower than others, and therefore slices of a year could disproportionately represent how much or how little staff are working. But if you take the full year, the full set of data, you get a really good sense of, on average, over the course of the year, is this human being a full-time person or not? Do they work 30 hours a week on average or not? Okay, so after you measure, after your measurement period, you then have a stability period where you've now determined, hey, was that employee full-time or not based on, the results of that measurement period, and you leave that person regardless of hours worked in the stability period. And that's kind of a big thing that groups, sometimes they try to go into the system and they try to make manual clicks and adjustments because, oh, this guy went to part-time, or, oh, this guy went to full-time. Do not adjust for that. Do not worry about it. You're in the middle of your stability period. It does not matter the hours they work in the stability period. You're holding them steady based on the results of what you've already measured. Okay. Likewise, if an employee did not work full-time during the measurement period, you treat the employee as not full-time during the entire stability period, regardless of hours worked. It does not matter how much that person worked or didn't work during the stability period. They are not getting themselves onto or off of the benefits. The stability period is frozen. Everyone's frozen. We're sticking it out based on the results of the measurement period. Okay. The stability period, the length of time as you're setting this, it has a couple of rules to it. Again, no more than 12. This one's no less than 6. So it can get a little wonky if in your measurement you're not doing 12 months. But the rule number 3 here, at least as long as what you did for your standard measurement. So if you're going to measure for 12 months, then your stability needs to be 12 months. Okay, and lastly, because there is some time that's needed between finishing my measurement period and then building out the system, doing open enrollment with all the employees, communicating to the folks which ones are eligible, which ones are not, et cetera, et cetera. The law gives what they call an administration period that cannot exceed 90 days. So I'll walk us through a quick example. Let's say that this employer chose their measurement period to be the 12-month period from mid-October to mid-October. And they did that because they listened to Toby and they wanted their stability period to run concurrent with their plan year. So we already have a 12-month thing in the health insurance world, and that's the plan year. So if you have a health insurance plan year that happens to run concurrent with the calendar year, as many folks do, you want to make sure that your stability period starts on 1/1. And regardless of what your plan year is, you want your stability period to line up with that. So when I have groups that have, for example, an April 1st renewal, I recommend that they make their stability period, the annual period, of 4/1 to 4/1. And then again, you back this stuff up to where you go, okay, I'm going to have my administration period be no more than 90 days, but get me about as much time as possible that coincides with payroll. So in this group's case, just as an example, let's say they run payroll on, the 1st and the 15th type of a thing. So they're like, all right, we're going to have our admin period run concurrent with that mid-October to year end. So we can't do October 1st because that would eclipse 90 days, but we can do October 15th, give ourselves as much time as possible. And so graphically, it looks like this, right? To where from mid-October to mid-October, we're measuring employees, okay? This is where all ongoing employees are evaluated to see if they're averaging 30 hours per week or more. And again, in the Paycom system, we have really handsome reporting. We can do this on a month-by-month basis so that we don't get to October 14th of 2023 and have any surprises. On a month-over-month basis, we could just pull up those reports. They run automatically every month and just check and see who's pacing for full-time. Are they lining up with the people I think, right? Maybe you have some part-time people and the managers are pulling them more than you thought and they're starting to average more hours than you wanted. And as an organization, you don't want that person to be benefits eligible next year. So you need to tell the manager to spread the love a little bit, right? You can look at these reports on a monthly basis, but long story short, you draw 2 lines in the sand, measure, and then you see, okay, who was working at least 30 hours per week? And then you give yourself the admin period, during which time you crunch the results, you roll out an open enrollment period, you ask employees to fill in their applications, whether that's, old school paper or, more likely in the benefits module. Hey, go into the system, click through, you are on our plan year for next year, and then you've got your stability period. Where during this time, you treat all ongoing employees according to the results of that measurement period, regardless of their hours worked, right? They're locked in. So everybody in the green box that measured as a full-timer, you leave on the benefit so long as they're employed, for the whole red box and vice versa. And so people say, well, what if they worked more hours? I don't understand if their hours go up or down. You go, yes, that's accounted for in the subsequent years, right? So this measurement period here begets this admin period, which corresponds to this specific stability period. If the person worked, let's say, less hours on the front end of that first green box, but more towards the end, and now by the time they get into that red box, they're really pacing as a full-timer, great. That'll show up in the next measurement period, and then that person will be added in the subsequent year, and it goes on and on and on, where we say, all right, we're constantly measuring, and that will be for the subsequent stability period for the subsequent plan year. And so we set these things up like that. Okay. What about new hires? Well, for new hires, the ACA says waiting periods cannot exceed 90 days. Okay, so that's where a lot of groups went, oh, okay, I need to adjust. Because back in the day, a lot of people's waiting period was first of the month following 90 days. Obviously, that would eclipse that 90th day. So folks made their waiting period first of the month following 60 days, or first of the month following 30 days, or some other variation that doesn't eclipse 90 days. That being said, inside of the legislation, there are actually a couple of different types of employee. They don't really mess around with full-time and part-time. That's something that employers kind of make up, and they might fudge, they might get wrong. But you might have an employee who's a variable hour employee. Okay, so the IRS gave a few definitions of this, and it's even someone that you hire in a retail space. This is an IRS example in December, and they're going to be working crazy hours because you guys are super busy. But after the holiday season, come February, come March, is this person still going to be working that many hours? I genuinely don't know. And therefore, I've tagged this person as a variable hour employee. You hired them into a role where you could defensively say, I wasn't sure on an ongoing basis if they would truly be full-time, week in, week out, month in and month out. So for those variable hour employees, you can subject them to an initial measurement period. Again, if they're not variable hour employees, they need to be on the benefits inside of 90 days. But if they are, that's where you set the system up to say, okay, we also need to account for an initial measurement period for those employees that get brought in and tagged into that variable hour category, which works a lot like the standard stuff. Okay, so you've got an initial measurement period, and that term is used to distinguish it from the standard, which is the ongoing. And this is a new hire at that person's new hire date. It needs to satisfy the following, which again, I always recommend. And I work with lots of groups that are like, hospitality and food and beverage and, in worlds where they have a lot of variable hour employees, and they are, unfortunately, if you're not hired into certain roles, they're from a budgetary standpoint, not interested in adding people to the insurance, right? So they want the full 12-month waiting period for these new hires that fall into this category because it's what fits their budget, right? So you want as much data as possible before you say, okay, I guess this person really is full-time. Okay, fine. And just like before on the standard stuff, the initial stuff begets a stability period, which also has a few different rules, right? But what's consistent is if the employee didn't work full-time, then you don't need to add them to the benefits, and vice versa. The stability period here has several different rules, but yet again, rule 3, at least the same length of time you chose for the ongoing measurement period, right? So, and for the stability period you chose for ongoing employees, right? So long story short, when you back all this up, if you picked your standard measurement period to be 12 months, that means your standard stability period is 12 months, the initial measurement period, the initial stability period, all these things become that 12-month window. Okay. Yet again, on the initial side, you have an administrative period where you can say, all right, from an admin standpoint, now that we're talking about new hires, I have to do this stuff every month, right? So if you have a 12-month initial measurement period, that means that you've got whatever variable hour employees were hired in that month that you need to revisit at their anniversary. And you need to see, so every month on a monthly basis, who's coming up on their 1-year anniversary, who of them were put into the variable hour category, and how many of them actually ended up working full-time hours? How many do I need to add to benefits? How many do I not need to add to benefits, right? So when we're checking, I think there's like 4 or 5 really nice reports that just automatically run every month in Paycom. This is another one. This is sort of why you're checking those reports, right? The admin period on the initial side has to satisfy two things: less than or equal to 90 days from the date of hire to when you put them on coverage, excluding the measurement period, right? In other words, data hire, and then I start the initial measurement period. And the reason that there might be a timeline here is some groups start their initial measurement on the date of hire. That's when they start it. Many groups do. However, others, because they hire so many variable hour people, just lump them all into a single month. So maybe that person's data hire was, whatever today is, December 19th. And I took all my December variable hour people and I start measuring them on January 1, right? So there's a few weeks of their employment, in other words, that needs to be accounted for. And then whenever the initial measurement period ends, right, when they get to their 1-year anniversary and when the benefits kick in, all of this plus this, so you don't need to count the measurement period, but this plus this cannot exceed 90 days, right? That is the more complicated, less important one, because I think that the second rule is really all we ever need to follow, which is cannot, when added together, exceed first of the month following 30 days of their anniversary. In other words, here's my employee when they were hired, and then I subjected that person to a 12-month waiting period. Okay, I said, hey, you're in your initial measurement period because you've been hired as a variable hour employee. And at their anniversary, I now tell that employee, congrats, we're happy to have you here for a year. You will be on the benefits sooner than first of the month following 30 days. Okay, so that is the allotted administration period. So all of these employees, when they get to their anniversary, you need to be looking at them. So every month, pulling that report, who's at their anniversary, and knowing you've got a window of first of the month following 30 days of that anniversary to add them to the benefits if they were actually benefits eligible. So during the course of the year, they worked that requisite 30-hour per week. Okay. Now, a lot of times people are like, okay, I get it. I'm setting up the system, but how do I transition my new hires to full-time? And that I think is best done with a few different graphs, right? So let's go back to that same employer and let's talk about them having a 12-month initial measurement period. Okay. So I've got my same employer, and this employer has that same October 15th to October 15th measurement period, that same calendar year stability period, but they hire somebody on May 10th. So that employee gets to their anniversary 1 year later. They have that initial administrative period and then their initial stability period. So if this is the employee's data hire, when you're measuring, if the employee is full-time in the light green box. So boy, you got to May 9th of 2023. You looked back and you thought, wow, okay, the person worked 1,560 hours or more. They worked 30 hours per week times 52 weeks or more. This person that has been not added to our benefits, that was told that they're a variable hour employee, it turns out they did so much work that they should have been on our benefits. Well, then I need to get them into Paycom. I need to get them into the system sometime between May 10th and the end of June, because they need to be on the benefits before first of the month following 30 days, right? Now, because this employee, as you can see, when you start getting to October 14th of 2023, that employee has been here for 16 months, 17 months, whatever the case is. So when you pull records from 10/15 of 22 through to mid-October of 23, you will have a full 365 days with that employee. So measure them again, even though they're in the middle of their stability period, because this is how they get transitioned up. They need to be measured again. They need to be included in that measurement period. And if they're also full-time, then they get benefits all the way through to the end of the stability period, right? This is the one that makes the most sense. This is the easy one. But there's a couple other combinations, and we just need to make sure that we're aware of them, that we're setting up our system properly. Because if we have the same company with the same new hire on May 10th, and the employee's full-time, they did a ton of work when they were initially brought on. They were bunch of shifts, bunch of this, that, and the third, but they ultimately dwindled down a little bit over the summer and into the fall. Okay. So because they were full-time in that light green box. When I got to May 9th, I've collected their application. I've sent them into Paycom. I've added them to the benefits for July 1st. But when I remeasured up here, they're not full-time. The employee gets that light red box because we subjected them to the light green box. So they need to be kept on the benefits, added through open enrollment, and they get to go all the way through to June 30 because you owe them a 12-month stability period because you subjected them to a 12-month initial measurement period. And during that first 12-month initial measurement period, that person indeed worked 1,560 hours or more. Conversely, if the person didn't work a ton of hours off the bat, so when you first measure, they're not full-time, but they started working a bunch more. So when you did your ongoing standard measurement period, the person is full-time. You don't get to keep them off benefits through the whole light red box. You have to add them onto benefits and keep them on through the end of the stability period. In other words, we need to make sure that we're defaulting to whatever's more favorable to the employee, right? So we've hired that person as a variable hour employee, subject them to that full 12-month initial waiting period. And so now they need either the benefit of that light green box, or if they wound up being a benefactor of the dark green box, then they get whatever's more favorable. The last combination of this is the easiest one, where let's say we hire that person on May 10th. We measure they're not full-time. No problem. We measure it again. They're still not full-time. No problem. They still don't have benefits now in this case all the way through of 2024. And then we'll get back to that world where we're measuring again and again on the ongoing basis. So this is how we have to set up our system. We have to understand what the legislation is asking of us from an employer standpoint so that we can leverage our technology and our tools. And again, those reports that come in automatically, Forms 13 and on the ACA side in the Paycom system, there's a few different really, really helpful spots, including, I think it's Form 17, where we get into the ACA reporting. So now we say, okay, the very first part of this presentation, use that qualifying sentence of eligible employers need to offer affordable coverage to eligible employees. And now we've unpacked the law, precisely what it means by an eligible employer. What is an ALE and how do you get there, right? That 50 employee, adding our full-time equivalents, et cetera. We talked about affordable coverage, right? It's not just the actuarial value of the plan, but it's how you do the premiums and what you split it by, right? W-2, rate of pay, federal poverty limit. And then we talked about which employees, exactly which employees, right? The full-timers are obvious. Those guys are easy, and I got to hit 95% of them. But I need to know, how do I determine full-timers when not everybody is showing up, Monday to Friday, 8 to 5? I've got folks working different shift work, and I need to know if the law would call them full-time or not, right? So we talked about the look back stability period, the safe harbors we have for measurement, where we can, leverage the reports on a monthly basis, draw the lines in the sand, and pull our final reports on those annual bases to figure out precisely who do we need to extend coverage to. They don't have to take it, but we need to make sure we're extending it to 95% of our people, because the last thing we want to do is incur that nearly $3,000 fine per year per employee. But we also have to tell the IRS we're doing the right thing. The IRS doesn't just trust us to do the right thing. So the good news is they created new IRS section codes, and that's sort of how we all felt about it. But 6055 and 6056 are new IRS section codes that are designed to help both understand on a provider of coverage standpoint who had insurance, and then on the employer side, who extended coverage like they were supposed to and who didn't, and therefore which employees might be eligible for subsidies. Because part of the legislation said, hey, you have to have an insurance plan, but we understand not everybody can necessarily afford one, so we will provide subsidies, but we're trying not to provide more subsidies than need be, so we're going to lean on employers where possible. Okay, so we've got Forms 1094B, 1094C, 1095B, and 1095C, and I just kind of want to unpack the kind of 1090s, right? So generally speaking, an employer is going to have to file Forms 1094C and 1095C by February 28th if filing on paper, or March 31st if filing electronically. You have to file electronically if you're going to do more than 250. for the following calendar year, right? So for calendar year of 2023, the one we're in now, Forms 1094C and 1095C are required to be filed by February 28th, 2024, or April 1st if someone is filing electronically. So those are the due dates on a federal basis. We'll get into California in a minute. Now, to help keep straight the 4s and 5s, I have my little joke that 4 is for transmitting. In other words, the 1094C is the transmittal form for the 1095C, right? So it's sort of like the cover sheet, right? Where a little bit like a W-2, I suppose, where W-2 is like an annual snapshot of my relationship to my employee. Obviously, that it has to do with wages. The 1095C is an annual snapshot of my relationship to my employee with respect to the health insurance relationship, right? And so I'll give everybody a 1095C, and then the 1094 is like the cover sheet. So when I give a copy of all of them to the IRS and everybody gets a 1095 and the IRS gets a copy of everybody's 1095, I slap a 1094 for transmitting on top of it. So that's my little quick tip. All right. So then what's the difference between B and C? Basically, C, I like to say, stands for company or client, right? These are the ones that almost everyone's going to have to do. This is the one where we're telling the IRS how we engaged our insurance relationship, okay? And again, we have to provide everyone a 1095C by March 1st. State of California actually says January 31st. And we need to file copies of that transmittal form with 1094C to the IRS either by the end of February or the end of March, depending upon if we're filing paper or electronic. And we have to file electronic if we're doing more than 250 of these bad boys. Okay. So the 1095C is the company one. It's the one that's going to apply to most of the companies. The 1095B is like the big boys, right? So like mainly the carriers, to be honest with you. So if you're telling our employees, hey, look out for your 1095B, that's just going to be the proof of coverage thing, right? That's going to say, hey, you had health insurance. That's going to be for you to satisfy your individual mandate, which on a federal level was walked back recently, but does still apply on a state level. California still has an individual mandate. So they need that 1095B to show whether or not they had insurance at all. But the 1095C is going to come from their company. It's going to come from our clients. And that is going to have 3 parts. So it's largely populated by our system of records, largely populated by Paycom based on all the data we put in. So it's, junk in, junk out type of a thing. And that's why where, we understand what the legislation is asking for, we can help build out the system appropriately. Part 1 is easy. That's identifying info. Hey, what's your name, your address, your social, et cetera. Part 3 is only for self-funded groups, right? And because if you're self-funded, you're sort of technically the insurance company, just from like a insurance nuance standpoint. And therefore, rather than making these employers do the C and the B, because they're both a company and an insurance carrier, we just said, all right, let's add part 3 where we can just get all the belly buttons that are covered. So this is just a roster of everyone that's covered. So part 1 is easy. Part 3 is fairly easy and also only applies to certain groups. It's really part 2 that gets tricky, right? Lines 14, 15, and 16, or I think a lot of the confusion could possibly lie. Okay. Again, 1095B is how they're policing the individual mandate. That's going to be carriers, companies, a little bit of nuance where if you are self-insured, but too small to be an ALE, because only ALEs need to do all this stuff, right? So if you have fewer than 50 people, you don't need to do all this stuff. So you might not be doing a 1095C. Well, you still need to do the B then if you're a small self-insured company, because again, you're technically the insurance company. So that's who does the B. That's who does the C. Most of our companies are doing a 1094, 1095C, and many of them are skipping part 3 because their insurance relationship is fully insured. Now, I understand that I have to do a form, but how do I do the form? Okay. Again, part 1 is basic information. Part 3 is self-funded only. Part 2 is the one that has these codes associated with them. Lines 14, 15, and 16. And that's where we're going to spend a little bit of time diving into some of the nuance here to close out today's presentation. Okay. Employers use one of 8 codes to report on line 14 the type of offer of coverage made on a month-by-month basis. And then obviously if one single code applies, you don't need to put it into every box. You can just put the all 12 months, right? So nothing on this line signifies whether the employee elected coverage. Whatever decision that person made, don't know, don't care. This is the way of telling the IRS what we did that made us compliant, that we offered the coverage, right? That is the employer's job, to offer coverage, okay? So here are the codes, and here are some of their commonalities, right? Code 1A is used anytime, yes, we offered coverage, and the way we offered coverage that we know is compliant, it was compliant relative to the federal poverty limit, right? So that's that about $101 per month level. And again, it's indexed every year. The percentage is indexed every year. The federal poverty limit is indexed every year. But if you can use that, if you have a plan in your portfolio where the employee only, the cheapest option, not the plan they took, fits, then you can use that. And if you're using that, you're using 1A, okay? Some of the other ones are more rare or more common. 1E is another pretty common one because it means we offered coverage. Maybe we didn't use the federal poverty limit, but we offered coverage, right? So the other ones that are rarer are because you offer coverage to some, but not all of the dependents, like, children, but not spouses, sort of a thing, which is very uncommon. And then the last really common one is 1H, no offer of coverage, right? And maybe that's because the employee wasn't employed in that month, or they were in a waiting period that month, or maybe they terminated earlier in the year. So we're talking about, they're gone now. But 1H, for whatever reason, on this month, did we offer coverage? If the answer is no, it's 1H. If the answer is yes for the federal poverty limit, it's 1A. If the answer is yes for another reason, it's 1E, right? So these are some of the common codes on the 1 series stuff. Okay, line 15, you might not have to put anything in, but depending upon what you put in 14, you indeed might, right? And if you do, what goes into line 15 is the cheapest employee-only option in the portfolio. It is not what the employee took. I don't care what they enrolled in, and I don't care how much that costs. Line 15 is where you tell the IRS, if you didn't use 1A, if you did use 1A, they know why it's affordable. It's affordable because of the federal poverty limit. You're good. If you didn't use 1A, you're just telling them, I promise it's affordable, and they're going to say, then why? Show me on line 15 why this is affordable. Give me a dollar figure, right? So you just put in the lowest cost premium for employee only, not the plan they actually chose. Okay. That leads us to line 16, which does not always need to be completed also, by the way. But if one of the codes fits, we need to complete line 16, which is sort of the last of the tricky parts. It's the 2 series codes, right? And I have noted here 2C is a super code. My hilarious insurance guy joke is that the IRS likes a 2C code 2C. So regardless of anything else that might fit, this is the Trump code. Anytime an employee is enrolled in coverage, any month, you use 2C. If the employee is enrolled in benefits in that month, then that month's code needs to say 2C. They're enrolled for the whole month, that code needs to say 2C, right? So that is the Trump code. Other than that, you've got various reasons that are somewhat self-explanatory. The employee was not employed that month, right? We didn't have them yet, right? Or they're in a waiting period, they did not take my insurance. But Mr. and Mrs. IRS, I promised my insurance was affordable. And maybe it was affordable because 2F, I used the W-2, or maybe it was affordable because 2G, I used the federal poverty limit, or maybe it's affordable because 2H, I used the rate of pay, right? So this is where you're telling the IRS what happened with that person's insurance. If they enrolled, it's 2C. If they didn't, but hey, man, well, go check 1A because I'm using that federal poverty limit safe harbor, and double check me right here on 2G because I had affordable plans. Not my fault they didn't take them. I do not want a penalty to come down the pike. Please and thank you, Mr. and Mrs. IRS. So that is those series codes. That basically takes us to the end of the presentation with respects to understanding the legislation, the wording, the verbiage, and maybe that helping us understand some of the reports that are in the Paycom system that we can be accessing every month, helping us to understand kind of how, when we go to set this stuff up, what the legislation's really talking about. So I'm going to stop share here, and I'm also going to stop the recording and just see